Yeah, thanks, Hannah and A for being on this call with me. It's man, our relationship goes back. And A, you and me, we go back to Korea, 1997.
7 or 8,
Yeah,
yeah. It would have
yeah.
been after 1996, but
It's
before
craziness,
2000.
craziness. Yeah. And Hannah and I, we got to know each other as therapists
Hmm.
starting in,
Mm.
2015, maybe, or 16.
Yeah, I don't remember when the first
Mm.
time was, but I think
Yeah.
it was when you were doing the pastor and therapist,
The meet and greet.
the meeting. Yeah, the meet and greet.
Oh,
That's right.
okay.
Yeah. So I have a
That was
really
a while ago.
enjoyable history with both of you. And excuse me, I'm just really glad that we can have this talk about premarital therapy, especially as it
Mm.
pertains to helping pastors. You know, the pastors are the ones who submitted these questions. And
Mm.
so that means that this is on their minds. And so if we can just have a very open conversation about our opinions, our experiences regarding these topics, I think it'll be just helpful for them to listen to. So I'll just go through these questions one by one and see, where things go. The first question that we can answer today is, what do we do when one person is a believer and the other person is not? Um,
Mm.
and I think that the anxiety that comes up for a pastor is going to be different than any sort of feelings that come up for a therapist, right?
Mhm.
So maybe we can just talk about it openly as a therapist, but then
Mm.
also try to get into the mind of a pastor as you're kind of talking out loud. So, anyone want to jump in first and provide just your first thoughts about this question?
Hannah?
She's deferring to you.
I've most of my clients have actually been similar faith. I think I've had one Catholic and Protestant. But as a therapist, faith can be an issue because the one of the instruments that I use, the Prepare and Enrich assessment, goes over some of those differences. And I think
Mhm.
more than is this right or wrong, I mean, I think the question that they have to tackle for themselves is what are our core values when it
Mm.
comes to spirituality? And more than the religious aspect, like for instance, if the female is Christian and the male can be either nominal or non-Christian, I think the biggest thing, the hurdle is, are we going to go to church together? How are we going to raise our children? So I think
Ah,
those, when it comes to how
Mm.
we're going to now meld our values together, is when that becomes an issue. In
mm,
terms of
Mm.
how to approach therapy, my approach would be exactly the same as to, just seeing them from where they're coming from and where they're at.
mhm,
Mm.
Even
Mhm.
people of two faiths, same faith, can also change over the course of marriage. And so I think when they first start, it's really important to nail what is important about their faith, or where, like, what is their faith background, and
mhm,
how will they navigate the maybe core value differences. They might have the same
Mm.
core
Mm.
values but different faith. And so I
mhm.
think
Mm.
as a therapist, those are the areas that I'll tap into. Versus, I think if a pastor has certain, I guess, their own protocol for marrying
Mm.
their congregants, or people who ask them, I think they will definitely need to, like, how important is it to them? Like, will it get in the way of taking responsibility for officiating the wedding? So I think that might
Hey,
be a little bit different from
yeah,
a
Mm.
things get a
pastor's
bit more
perspective.
personal for the
Very
pastor.
personal, because there's a level of
Mm.
investment that goes into this couple. I mean, they're not just marrying them and writing a piece of paper, but this is, I mean, the pastors that I've spoken to, they're invested in their relationship,
Yeah,
and they want to make sure that
Mm.
there's a follow through.
yeah.
So that's just a little bit of what
Thanks
I've
for starting us
learned.
off. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's a good
Yeah.
point. Some good points that you made. Renee, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I really agree with everything that Hannah said, especially I might jump in to think a little bit about I don't use prepare enrich as much. I only do it if it's specifically requested by the couple, but because I prefer using Hannah also uses this, the restoration model, which helps them unpack where they get stuck. And so
Mm.
that actually is very flexible in terms of sometimes they get stuck on issues of faith, especially even if I think what I see also is they may have a similar faith background, like they may both be Christian, but they really differ on what that looks like. So that's a common conflict. But I do have some couples, not necessarily as often premarital, where one is either their faith is very important to them, and the other has either a different faith or more often is more like agnostic. Um, but the advantage of approaching it through therapy is that even with that, you do this deeper search of what is important to each couple, but also you examine why do they get stuck in their conflict points. It's not just the external stressors,
Mm.
but what what is important to them uh, gets sort of overlooked by the other partner and vice versa. And that all is very rich ground for talking about how their faith interacts with that. So it's easy to bring out the conversation. And so I think the whole point of premarital is not to do the actual counseling, but to bring to light the issues that they face as a couple, so
Mm.
that they can make a decision with their community um, uh, of their family, their friends, their faith community, to really discern. It should be a discernment process for the couple.
Mm.
But sadly, this is a big plug to pastors out there. Get your couples to premarital counseling before they get engaged. So there's a lot more willingness and flexibility without the stress of planning a wedding, so that they can actually figure out, can we make it work with the resources that we have, which would include their supportive community.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, a lot of good thoughts here. I was thinking through this question as well, and kind of going back to my memories of being a pastor. One of the problems that I faced, and I think other pastors may go through this too, is that I'm so focused on trying to figure out what God wants.
mm,
And, I felt like it was my duty to defend God's honor, right? To defend what I felt was the ideal that God has set forth, to the point where I would be tempted to not really care what the couple wants. What they want is irrelevant, right? It's what God wants that you should be thinking about. To the point of like, rebuking them, that kind of stuff. Like it was awful. It was ugly, And I get where pastors are coming from. Like they really feel that they are God's instrument, God's vessel, and God's word is utmost. And we must all submit to God's word, even if we don't like it. Like that's what we should be aspiring to. And they feel like that is their greatest calling, is to make that front and center, right? Christ-centered marriage, like that should be Christ-centered family. And so what happens is that pastors can even get blinded to the fact that two people could be churchgoers like their whole life, but completely incompatible, you know? But as long as they're both believers, we're good, Whereas I've seen a believer and a non-believer who are so compatible because they understand how to like communicate with one another, how to respect boundaries with one another. They learn how to even raise kids in a family where they have different beliefs, and they do it kind of seamlessly. Whereas, again, people from two Christian households, they could be so toxic with each other, but the pastor is thinking that's okay as long as you're both believers. And so there's something kind of amiss there that I remember from my pastoring days, that the focus is on trying to reach some high level position, not position, high level place status of being, with one another, while completely missing a really essential component of this relationship. And I feel like as a pastor, I couldn't give up that control. My anxiety drove me, where what's going to happen? Like, is this going to fall upon me if I go ahead and officiate this wedding? Will I be seen as lax in what's going to become of my reputation? And will I enable doom upon this couple because one is a believer and one is not? Right. So going back to the personal things that pastors go through, like I never really thought to think, I never really stopped to think that maybe what I value for this couple is not what the couple values as strongly. And maybe, I don't know, I felt like, because I was in a position of authority, that I was called to be the person that knows better than you. You know what I'm saying? So it's tough. Like, I know that some pastors will really struggle with this. And I think I know their heart that they want to submit to God so much, but I think it gets to a point where it can get pretty dangerous, like especially in the ways that they try to pastor these people. So these are some of the thoughts that were coming up as you guys were sharing. Yeah, any feedback about what any person said about?
Yeah, I've spoken to a few pastors, not like maybe like outside the church or even within the church too, whether they're marrying the couple or not. But I mean, from my conversations, the pastors that I know of will not marry if one of the party is not a believer.
Yeah, I get that.
I think that's a very strong, I guess, the foundation of what they believe. Or if that were to happen, if you were then, one of the non-believer would commit to at least just being open to the faith. So I don't know how it is now, but the pastors that I've spoken to do stand on that belief, or that's where their foundation is. Now, having said that, I think what you're mentioning, I mean, it's a very human thing, but I also think that's a humongous responsibility and a burden to bear.
It is.
As a pastor, that you must now be the defender of this sacred covenant that God has ordained. And, so I could understand that the heaviness and the weight of that, and that your responsibility to carry through. But I think just thinking about, is that what God desires for these roles? And I think part of that too is we want and desire so much. And even as a therapist, when there's a couple that present such polar and opposing values, belief systems, Christian or not, it's really hard for me to be in the neutral ground and say, okay, we can make this work.
Yeah.
And especially if the ring is already on their finger and the wedding is looming,
right,
and parents are all on board.
right.
It is such I'm torn as well, and at the same time, I think our stance affords us a little bit of aloofness to bring things to light, like when he was saying, right? And this is what you're presented with.
Yeah, because none of us claim any sort of authority over this couple,
Yeah, even if they're flat out asking, do you think we're gonna make it? Like we can't give them an answer. We can say, here are your strengths, here are your challenges, and what do you think? But I really appreciate, Roy, you bringing that up, because I think I mean, I'm ordained as well, and I've never been in a position where I had to marry a couple that was not, um, you know, both believers.
Mhm.
Um, but but that but there's definitely, for Hannah too, I'm sure, and for you, Roy, as a Christian counselor, there are just some things that come up with in the lives and values of our clients where
Mhm.
we would really want to help guide in some way. And I
Mhm.
think when I run up against that tension, um, I I have to think about, well, what is God calling me to? And I think if you're a pastor who is in that place where you are very convinced that, at least as far as I understand God's will, this is my role. I have
Mhm.
to defend the faith.
Mhm.
You can't go against that and be authentic. So regardless of how I may see that particular stance, I
Yeah.
wouldn't want that pastor to go against their values,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
that's going to cause more harm in the
Yeah.
end. They'll just be more confused. It's
Mhm.
fine if that's one part and stage of your understanding of God, and then later on in life you realize, oh, I wish I had done that
Yeah.
differently, because this I
Yeah.
understand now more about
True.
God and the scriptures and what they say about
Yeah.
two people, and what's most Christ-like
Mhm.
Mm.
for each step of their life. And I think maybe if a pastor is wrestling with that, one thing that I find helpful for myself to think about is both pastors and therapists really, I think, fall under this umbrella of helping people's characters form,
Mhm.
but with this healthy balance of, is how much of it is really in our hands.
Mhm.
We are entrusted with a certain part and a certain ready receptivity from our roles that are given to us. But
Mhm.
can we trust that God can use that? But ultimately, it's the person in the pews that has to make a decision for themselves. It
Mm.
really is going to be their life. And to the extent that they're going to be committing to community with us and us to them,
Mhm.
then they give us more influence. But like, can we really recognize our own limits, as well as
Mhm.
the the really awesome and infinitely, like, knowing and caring aspect of God to guide and shepherd
Yeah.
the people that we are, that are in front of us, that we're wrestling about. So
Mm.
as a therapist, I know
Yeah.
we're always having to come back to that, like,
Yeah.
oh,
That's
how much
right.
can I really do?
Yeah, I want to add something. I really appreciate your perspective on being on both sides, and I mean I think what you're bringing up is responsibility and accountability, right? And
Mm,
also taking into account of God's character versus our character, even as fallen and sinful as we are. Both therapists and pastors. I mean, I think just pinpointing God's ultimate gentleness, as well as his character trumping everything else. One
mm,
thing I do want to highlight is that I think a lot of sometimes I think pastors might be driven by fear,
Mhm.
because divorce is now
mm,
becoming such a um, there's there's a lot happening, especially right now, over the past
mm, mm,
5-10 years. And so I think there might be more of a fear-driven response versus maybe a faith or trust-driven response, because
Mhm.
there might be times when I think
mm,
pastors married someone and they have like maybe 3-4 failed, how about like 5 failed marriages, and what is that to say about
mm,
them and what their part in that? So I think it's a
mm,
very, very real fear, and even for us too as therapists, like let's say at the end of our sessions, like I'm so or more confident that this marriage is ordained by God, and they're two very, they've grown a lot, and maybe a few years down the line, it's like, what happened?
Yeah.
So I think there's propensity to be driven by fear, us included. And
Yeah.
so maybe what does that look like for us to truly give over to, faith and trust driven versus fear driven?
Yeah.
So
Right.
I think that's something that I have in the back of my head as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
I'm sure there's more to process, for this question. But I feel like we've given kind of a starting point, for pastors to really think through what their stance might be and why they have it. And is it more anxiety driven? Is it more like God honoring, whatever it is. I feel like, it was helpful for us to kind of broach that topic. I want to get to the next question. How much emphasis do we place on discussing sex during premarital counseling? So, I mean, this is a big topic because I wasn't quite sure what the pastor was alluding to, regarding this question. We can take a guess as to what they might mean, but maybe the way that we can tackle it is, how do we as professionals approach the topic of sex in our own premarital counseling? And then maybe we can give the pastor some clues as to what they also can kind of add to their discussion if they're going to do premarital counseling for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely essential to at least raise the question of their views on sex. To some degree, their sexual history as well, so that at least both partners are aware of where they're coming from. And then work very actively on expectations, like what are sexual expectations, and even sexual knowledge and resources, because everyone has different degrees of awareness of what sex actually is and how it works. And especially if you're a Christian, you're supposed to not know anything explicit about sex, and yet we have all these avenues where we're learning something. And some of it is helpful, some of it isn't. And so I think it has to be raised at least in one of the conversations. I have found that it won't be raised by the participants in counseling if you don't bring it up, because there's always plenty of other stuff to talk about too, and it's actually usually more on the forefront of their mind. And I think there's also fear, like maybe the couple is already engaging in sex before they're married, and they have different beliefs or attitudes about that. That can be that should also come to the table, but it's sometimes difficult if like they have a really big in-law problem. And so it's a little tough in premarital to gauge which one you want to lock in on, but I think at least the question has to be asked. Like, what are your views on sex? Do you know what will bring satisfaction to each partner? Like, do you know what sexual arousal is, how it's different for men and women? Often, if we run out of time, I'll just give book titles and say, take this with you on your honeymoon, especially if you don't have friends and a mentor couple that is willing to be frank with you about how it actually works.
Yeah.
So that's like one end of it. And then on the other end is probably, Roy, where your expertise comes in. Maybe one partner is overly exposed and has to work on their sexual arousal in a non-addictive form. So that all, like, at least, but if you bring it out in the open, then you're not like, who did I just marry? And why isn't it working?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, really good stuff. Hannah, what about you?
Oh, I think you covered all bases in him. But one thing, going back to the restoration model, the pattern of where we get stuck, what happens when I feel this way and why do I react in this way? And I think when they know and understand their pain cycle, their negative cycle of how they feel and why they do, I feel like sometimes the sexual history, expectations, myths what have they been holding on to that
Mm.
may not be true or work in this particular intimate relationship. They are about to be intimate with at that, this is their most intimate, close, and connected partner.
Mm.
And so that physical intimacy can also be really shrouded with just a lot of false things, things that they hear, things they see, things that have been told to them by well-meaning people.
Mm.
And so I think it really is, I don't think there's a lot of unpacking, but it's just bringing to light. Why did they feel the way they feel about this topic, sex, sexual purity, sexual expectations? And I think a lot of it is, it's so vulnerable
It
that
is.
I think most people appreciate it when I just am so direct about it, because that is not one thing. And some people shy about it, but I've had multiple couples say, you know what, thank you so much for just being straight to the point, because this has been really hard to talk about. And so I think a lot of people could get hung up on are we having sex before marriage, after marriage? When is it okay? So I think some people might be coming to us, I guess, mentors or authority figures for permission. Is it okay? Is what I've done too shameful to talk about, even with my partner? And
Right.
so I think so much of this conversation has to be in a place of safety, and definitely a place of non-judgment, because they're coming in with so many layers. And so again, my job isn't to dig through, but it comes up. It definitely comes up. And I think that pain and peace model can really be that pain. What's their hang up? Where do they get stuck? Even
Yeah.
with sex, what can be a better way? What is a better cycle based on what's true and what's good?
Yeah.
And if they're Christian, what God has designed, it's never too late for couples to engage in God's design for purity and for their intimacy. And so I think this can really be an empowering conversation, but I think there's a fear that it's going to take them into a more judgmental and more like stuck in their shame. So I really feel like I feel like this can be a very empowering space, both with pastors and with therapists, to to highlight everything that Eunhae, what you shared. So
I really love that. And it's so beautiful. I mean, to think about that. And I think too, I mean, both for therapists and pastors, really the only way to feel comfortable with it is to deal with our own stuff first.
yeah.
And to rigorously hash out what is our theology about what God means when he gives us sex, and to engage with that, read the books, think through things, pray like scripture, and do your own therapy work with you and your spouse. Like, where are we getting stuck in sex? And so just like, and like practicing talking with, maybe if you have a pastor group of friends, talking about sexual topics, and how you would talk about it with parishioners. So actually just forcing yourself to talk about it sometimes helps you get over the nerves of talking and bringing it up.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
That's right. If you really think about it, I think the discussion of sex will uncover so many things about each person. And it's such a intimate topic, and there is so much potential for shame to be embedded in it, that by not talking about it, we're really not putting forth our true self, to the other person. So I think a pastor can be doing a lot of favors for the couple by broaching the topic and providing a safe space to talk about it. But they should also be aware of what kind of box they may be opening up, because there could be so much shame attached to these things that it could be a very emotional time. Hannah, you're talking about, have my behaviors been too shameful, Would it be too shameful for my partner to hear?
Mhm.
Mm.
That's a big secret,
Mhm.
you know? And to keep that secret going for the duration of the marriage, or for however long they can keep it going, that's a big uh, wall that blocks intimacy, you know, not just sexual intimacy, but real relational intimacy with that person. But that the question itself is so crucial. Like, not only is my behaviors too shameful for my partner, am I too shameful for my partner?
Yeah.
Right. And that's why, going back
Mm.
to Ine's point, like, it's way better to have these conversations prior to getting engaged, right? When, you know, you haven't already put your deposit down for this and that,
Oh my goodness.
right? But to really have these conversations and realize maybe the basis of our relationship isn't as strong as I thought. You know, maybe like if I'm holding on to these big doubts about whether my authentic self is too shameful for my partner, geez, that question needs to be answered, you know?
Mm.
And I hope that the answer is a resounding no, you are not too shameful for me. In fact, I want all of you, you know, even history and all, I want you.
Yeah.
But that hopefully is the conviction that they have as they say, okay, if that's the case, then yes, let's get married, right? But if you're hanging on to that question, you don't know the answer to it, and you go into marriage anyway, like, what's gonna
So true.
motivate you to reveal that secret, even like in marriage, you know?
Like, now I
Um,
got you.
yeah, exactly. I got you. So I've got this question for the two of you. Obviously, without divulging any specifics, you know, you kind of speak in generalities. Can you think of times where the topic of sex was broached in premarital and the discussion really went bad? Like, it revealed something where the one person was like, what? You know, and like and really caused like conflict, and they maybe regretted like ever talking about that in the first place. Can you recall things like that or no?
Mm,
Not
not in
not in my
mine.
case.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that some pastors might be afraid of. Like, what am I going to uncover? If, you know, am I going to open Pandora's box by broaching this
Mm.
topic? I can think of maybe like a few isolated cases where one person really assumed that the other person was a virgin, and
Mm.
it came out that they weren't. And, you know, it was like, it kind of shattered them. It's
Mm.
like,
Mm.
I really thought I knew who I was going to be married, but if you've been with other people, then like I can't get those images out of my head. Like,
Mm.
if you and I ever have sex, then I can't delete the fact that I'm with someone who's been kind of like tainted, right? For lack of better terms. Um, that's not the norm, but those reactions have come up, and there's a lot of processing that needs to be done with something like that. But I'm wondering whether something like that has ever come up for you guys.
No, not at the stage that I was meeting with them at. They seem to kind of know. And I'll ask too, even in the screening intake sometimes, do you have any addictions?
Yeah.
And I mean, I didn't do it as often with premarital because I think,
Mhm.
especially when I was starting out, I had more of this assumption, oh, they're happy. They just want to, gain some skills before they get married. Like, no, that's
Right.
not what happens. But yeah, I think it's like premarital, we're talking about 5 to 8 sessions. And so sometimes they may feel they don't have enough trust to share everything with
Yeah.
the counselor
Mhm.
too.
Yeah.
But often they will bring up, yeah, we know about each other's past relationships and
Yeah.
sexual um, history, or the way that, especially if they didn't have the same core values all their lives. They may
Hmm.
have different beliefs throughout different parts of their lives. And so
Yeah.
generally they have actually already known, which is kind of a plus. But then,
Yeah.
talking about it with us and seeing what more they can grow in.
Yeah. It means that they've already had a lot of experience in being upfront with one another, which is great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, it is helpful if they've already done that.
Yeah. So we can't cover all the rest of the questions. So maybe we can choose one of them. Okay. So one is about what if one of them has an addiction, or one of them has significant trauma history, any sort of follow-up that we provide after the wedding, like follow-up strategies, or maybe some favorite resources for premarital counseling. We covered some of the resources in the part one, so maybe we'll skip that one. But out of the addiction, the trauma history, or the follow-up, any of them feel like you have kind of a ready opinion about that?
I think you would definitely be a good person to respond to the addiction one. I mean, I don't know if maybe different types of addictions.
I can. I can. What about the two of you? Like, is there a you know, do any of these speak to you, like these questions?
I think for me, the like when there is uncovering or like trauma or addiction revealed, then I think that does, I think there needs to be a little bit more data or information gathering, some background, because whether it's present or past, I mean, I think that also makes a difference if they're actively in addiction, or if there is a trauma situation occurring.
Yeah.
I mean, I would, my instant my gut would tell me that they might, especially if they haven't processed it,
Yeah.
would definitely be okay. Let's really focus on. I think that individual support would be really helpful for with individual therapy. If it's something that has happened in the past, they've done some work around it, there's recovery and there's been repair in their relationship regarding this, then I think I will kind of keep that in the back of my head. And that could be a lens that I view their relationship with, if that does seem to be where they get triggered or trapped or stuck.
Yeah.
And so we could use some of those lenses of addiction and trauma, but I do feel like, especially if it's active, and especially if they haven't done their own work, then I would definitely refer them to individual, even prior to going into premarital.
Yeah.
Because I think that would definitely get in the way of our premarital, especially if there's things going on in the moment.
For sure.
And I'm trying to think about this from like a pastoral perspective, maybe who hasn't had any mental health training. But sometimes you find out anyway because you have a good relationship. I don't know how many pastors know this, but as therapists, we're trained to not do couples therapy if one partner has an addiction, or if there's abuse in the marriage, or if there are affairs, because it just doesn't work. Couples therapy is not effective in those cases because you can't build any trust and safety if any one of those things are happening. And so if you run across a case like that as a pastor, consult with your favorite therapist and get a sense of what they might recommend, she or he might recommend. And but more often than not, it will mean that more than working on the couple, maybe the partner can get support in some way, but the person who is suffering from severe trauma, or if there's any kind of abuse, or if there was cheating happening even before they get married, like or there's addiction, that person needs to work on their things, like Hannah said, before you can have a safe, even couples therapy environment. Yeah. I think too, like one other topic that kind of came to mind was there's a lot of undiagnosed mental health issues, especially in the Asian American community. And I think all of us have probably seen that when we're doing premarital. Most often it's both have some level of undiagnosed mental health, even
Mhm.
if it's something as common as anxiety or depression. But they don't, like, if it's not diagnosed, you kind of, everyone is like, each partner is wondering, why is this so hard? um, and it, without the proper support, you keep, it does a lot of damage to the relationship, because the partner, who, I mean, at different points, different, you, each partner might be going through their own mental illness issues, and without getting support through therapy or medication, or both, or finding the right changes in their life, like,
Mhm.
the relationship really won't take off because you're always like just struggling to like keep your head above water.
Yeah. The big dilemma I see is the couple's already engaged,
Mhm.
the wedding date's already set. The pastor is uncovering during the course of the conversation that one or both has either addictions or significant trauma in their life, and it comes out in ways that they think that they can manage, but they're managing pretty poorly.
Mm.
Um, do you advise that the pastor advise them to postpone that until they can really get some help for themselves, or is it like, for especially for Asian cultures, is it too late? you know, are the wheels already in motion?
I, yeah, that's a tough call. And I think that you really seek God's wisdom on that one.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it is a tough call. I feel like most people will do what they're going to do anyway,
Mhm.
regardless of, I mean, if the wheels are turning, and depending on their perspective on, both of their perspective on their marriage, and they will do it. So in that
Mhm.
case, I think the best case scenario is that they will stay connected to their spiritual community, as well as
Mm.
work through, now this is happening, now help, please help us, you guys were right, let's do something about it. So I don't think there's a
Mm.
hard answer, I don't think it's a black and white situation, but as long as they are open to do and continue their own work, I mean, in sickness and in health, right? I think a
Mm.
lot of people don't consider mental health or even trauma background as it comes to it will come out in some way, shape, or form in their marriage, because it comes out in their most intimate, closest partner, right? You're
Yeah.
sharing space, and especially during these times
Mhm.
where things are already hard,
Mhm.
it's a matter of time. And so if they continue, my strong encouragement is that they will continue to not withhold support from others, that they will not neglect the support, but they will actually welcome and invite that in as they're working through. So, will I encourage the pastor to have a very serious conversation about this postponing, possibly? I would most definitely encourage them, although everybody is entitled to, again, they're responsible and they're accountable for their own actions, and we
Mm.
just are there to help support whatever decision they make and be available when they do seek
Mm.
help. And so I guess
Yeah.
that's the follow-up, is that yes, I think it's imperative that we stay connected
Yeah.
as the best we can.
Yeah. There's so many different types of trauma.
Mhm.
But I think the most common ones that have come up in my discussions with couples is sexual trauma. And let's say one person has been sexually abused, and maybe this couple has not been sexually active with one another. That sexual trauma, more likely than not, is going to manifest itself somehow when they are sexually active in marriage. Whoever is the non-traumatized person, who's kind of like the observer, the witness of this trauma being manifest right in front of them,
Mhm.
Mm.
there's gonna be a lot of confusion, a lot of hurt, a lot of rejection, a lot of conflict. These are the kinds of things that I hope are talked about prior to getting married. So at least there's some sort of preparation for this because it's going to happen. So sexual trauma, there could be just a lot of psychological trauma from mom or dad,
Yeah.
like repeated voices, repeated messages, like you're nothing, you're worthless,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And so if they
Emotional
ever get into a
abuse.
conflict, right, then they would hear the same words coming from the spouse, and then all of a sudden they're flooded with mom or flooded with dad. I mean, really the list could go on. And there is a very strong tie between traumatic history and addiction history. When traumas occur or when certain triggers occur, most people will stumble upon some type of behavior that will allow them to dissociate or to medicate.
Yeah.
And they've been using that for years, and they don't talk about it with anyone because it's too shameful. And then they get married and they're supposed to reveal all this, like after they said their vows. And not only did they get triggered, but now they're doing their things such as, racking up credit card debt, or they are eating entire,
Cheesecake.
cheesecake, right? At 2 a.m., right?
Oops.
Or they are, binging on porn and masturbation for, an hour and a half secretly, because that has been their go-to way of coping with their trauma. And so now that has become addictive for them. These are huge things to talk about, but
Yeah.
I just hope that any pastors listening to this understands that these are essential things to be talking about in premarital, if not earlier, pre-engagement counseling, because most people do have trauma and most people do deal with their trauma poorly. And, you need to know, how do you yourself deal with trauma and how does your partner deal with trauma? And with that knowledge, is there a way to either cope better or to support one another or something? But it can't just be secretive, and it can't just be some sort of big bomb dropped on you like somewhere down the road.
It gets exhausting to even
Oh
hold
my
that.
gosh.
So exhausting. And now when kids come along,
Oh,
there's no space to even
right.
address that. And I think time is of the essence. When it's addressed earlier, I think is definitely, doing a lot more preventative work versus major intervention where you're at the end of your rope, your marriage is in peril.
Yeah.
And now this is the only way you've managed to cope. So we'll all go to our primal defenses and
Yes.
primal coping mechanisms to either
Yes.
numb, to medicate, to dissociate, to just soothe. So I just can't emphasize this enough. I think bringing things up early is going to be, it's going to cost you a lot of, it's going to prevent you from a lot of heartache and pain.
Yeah. Let me ask the both of you, just to kind of finish this question off. For the couple that's bringing this up, they might feel a lot of hesitation and embarrassment, fear, like answering the question, from the pastor about this. What, in your mind, is a good way for the pastor to broach the topic that feels safe for the couple to respond?
I think that depends a lot too on the relationship they already have with the pastor. But if they, like, let's say it's a couple that just calls you up and says, we want to get married in your church, and one of the requirements is that they have to do premarital counseling with one of the pastors at the church. I mean, that's a wonderful opportunity. And then I think it's a matter of creating a space where, to some degree, opening up about your own insecurities around difficult topics. If you have something you don't mind too much sharing, disclosure is the fastest way to create a humble space
Mhm.
and a safer space where it's a little more even.
Mm.
And then when they do share something, giving them some really good follow up listening and questions
Mm.
as opposed to advice,
Mm.
because that will really open up more sharing as opposed to, I'm going to put my feelers out. I really do want to disclose, and it's been hard for me.
Yeah.
Can I trust this, opportunity? And then you like start to say something, and then if a pastor is nervous, they might jump in like, "Oh, I totally get what you mean," like blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
Then the people will retract and yeah, not feel as safe.
Yeah. Thank you. Hannah, what about you?
I think from a very practical standpoint, um, the Prepare Enrich survey provides, I mean, they do answer. There's a section on sexual expectations. So I think even just presenting it as a way of, well, these are the, just kind of, I think when I meet with couples, or even I think pastors can do this too.
Mhm.
This is a very loose guideline of subjects or topics that we're going to discuss. And,
Mhm.
you know, and when you go over the results of the survey,
Mhm.
it's actually very non-threatening to bring it up, because this is just part and parcel to the assessment, the survey. So there's no, I mean, I think the biggest thing is like there's no judgment, right? With any of these topics, we'll talk about in-laws, we'll talk about finances, we'll talk about sexual expectations.
Mhm.
So I think if it's presented in a way that it's, oh yeah, it's part of the program, I think there will be less inclination um, to disclose what you're not comfortable with, but at the same time, there's an open space because, oh, it's just part of something that we're going to do. So I
Yeah.
think that could lend itself for an opening. And as much as whatever they disclose or not is up to the couple,
Yeah.
right? So I think, but as long as they know that, oh, this is just part of what we do,
Yeah.
I think that might take away some of the stigma or judgment or any form of opinions that the pastor has or even
Yeah.
the therapist has, and saying, these were the results. Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
That's true.
In closing, I just want to say that I remember the anxiety that I felt as a pastor doing premarital. I had either the thought of, okay, I got to get through this. I got to get through this. I got to, just it was more like a survivor's mentality getting through it, because it's related to the second topic, which second thing that I thought about, which is like I don't want to appear like a fraud. I want to appear like I know what I'm talking about. you know so my protection of my image was getting in the way of really connecting with a couple and really hearing them. So I want to be able to tell pastors that if that's the way that you feel, like you're not the only one who feels that way. But I will say that I have a lot of regrets about that. you know it's There's more often than not, I think the couple will really appreciate your humanity showing up, as opposed to you being the authority on God's word. You know,
Absolutely.
your humanity showing up, you sharing about some of your biggest regrets, sharing about what you don't know. Um, as Ine was saying, that there it creates a humble atmosphere for all three people, and it goes a long way in just being able to have a really forthright discussion that gets to the heart of the matter versus a pastor just sweating it through, because the sweating it through really just indicates that they're trying to perform, you know, as opposed to really serve and engage with the client as a person, like a red-blooded person who's really trying to connect with this couple and have a substantial conversation with them, and not just as the advice giver, but like as someone who's kind of along, like on this journey with them. So I hope that pastors can identify when they are falling into that trap, and to of course, like just talk to God about that. Let the gospel speak to them, that they're not a fraud. Even if they don't have the answers, like they're not a fraud, that they could be their authentic self, and that there's plenty of power in Christ's blood to cover over that amount of shame that you feel about yourself. And I feel like that's that in conjunction with the things that you both talked about, and in answer to these big questions, even though we can't exhaustively cover these questions, but I feel like it's enough to start the gears turning for a lot of the pastors who are watching this video. So I'm so grateful to the both of you for your time, and I hope to have you on again and in the future.
Thanks for creating this platform. I really appreciate
My
you
pleasure.
hosting this.
Thank you, Roy.
Yeah, you're very welcome.